Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to see so many of you here tonight, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stanley Temple, our speaker. It's fortuitous that Stan is here because he was kind enough to endorse the book that we have available tonight for you. And it is a pleasure to welcome him here again to Stevens Point, where he's been several times previously. You probably are aware that he is the Beers Bascom professor in conservation at the University of Wisconsin at Madison in the Department of Forestry and Wildlife Ecology. He is a distinguished avian ecologist and a conservation advocate. And tonight, in fact, his presentation will be more dealing with his interest in conservation advocacy, as of course highlighted with the writing of Aldo Leopold. A few things I should introduce about Dr. Temple. He has probably been recognized by virtually every organization that would be appropriate to recognize him for his distinguished work and contributions to conservation, to ornithology, and to conservation of biology in general. And just to name a few of those, and I had to write them down because the list is quite long and I won't take time to mention them all, but he's received special recognition from the Society for Conservation Biology, the Wildlife Society, the Wildlife Conservation Society, Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, American Ornithologists Union, and the Wisconsin Academy of Science, Arts, and Letters. And he was also just recently inducted into the Conservation Hall of Fame. So Dr. Temple has a very distinguished background, and he is also particularly well suited for the subject that he's going to spend this evening talking about, because for 32 years he held the position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that was previously held in years past by Aldo Leopold. He is also a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. In addition to that, I have to say that Dr. Temple is probably the epitome in my mind of the expression of a gentleman and a scholar. I've never seen or known anybody in my over 60 years of work in higher education who has known him, who has felt any differently about him. So a very, very delightful person, wonderful to have him here on this auspicious occasion, and particularly because of the 75-year anniversary this year for the publication of the Sand County Almanac. So, Dr. Temple, thank you. Oh, I also wanted to mention that I mentioned that he was kind enough to endorse this book, and so I have a copy here that I wanted to present him.
Thank you, Alan. And after that introduction, I'm a little embarrassed I wasn't more effusive in my praise of your book in the blurb, but thank you. Well, speaking to this group, I'm imagining all the hands are going to come up when I say, how many of you have read a Sand County Almanac? All right, okay, universal. So this will be historical review for you, and I hope telling you a few of the sort of stories behind some of the essays. Maybe I'll pick a few that are particular favorites of you. And as Alan said, you know, this is the 75th anniversary. This month, October 1949, Aldo Leopold's book finally got into print after several failures to find a publisher, which seems kind of odd today, but it was difficult to get this book published. So I imagine if you're like me, oops, and we've got a first technical problem here. Okay, let's see if I can do it this way. There we go. So if you're like me, the first time I read this book, the opening words in the foreword caught me by surprise because it resonated so much with me, even as a teenager. There are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot. So you're all cannots, I'm sure. So in the introduction to the book, Leopold gives us a nice sort of concise statement about where he's going. I do not imply that this philosophy of land was always clear to me. It is rather the end result of a life journey. Well, he didn't know, of course, that he was going to die of a heart attack the year before this book was published. So he didn't know that it was literally going to be the end of his life journey. But the life journey that he talks about here is essentially almost an outline of the book. He starts up growing up in Iowa, in Burlington, Iowa, on the banks of the Mississippi River. A really outdoorsy kid, influenced by a father who was an outdoorsman and one of the pioneering conservationists in the late 19th century. He decides that he wants to pursue a career in conservation. And back in the late 19th century, literally the only college degree that you could get that had anything remotely to do with conservation was forestry. So Aldo Leopold was one of the first graduates of Yale University with a degree in forestry. Like every one of his fellow graduates from the Yale School of Forestry, he was immediately hired for the brand new US Forest Service. And these young men, they were all men then, in their early 20s, were suddenly given the keys to millions of acres of publicly owned wildlands with instructions to figure out what's there and how to manage it. Hard to imagine doing that when you're 22 years old. But for Leopold, forestry was not his passion. Wildlife was his passion. And it didn't take long, even though his employer was the Forest Service, for Leopold's passion for wildlife to come through loud and clear. And eventually, he manages to convert, in sort of mid-career, manages to convert his career into one dedicated to wildlife conservation. And from there, he continued to evolve, gradually expanding the scope of his conservation focus from wildlife to what he called land. Today, we might talk about ecosystems or the biosphere. And the end result that he talks about and that he introduces to the world in this book is his concept of land health and the concept of a land ethic. Land health sort of being the objective of living sustainably on the planet, a land ethic being the moral compass that we follow to get there. So for Leopold, he really does trace his life journey throughout the book, as you'll see. So the 41 essays, the first part of the book, first half of the book, actually, the Almanac part, comes more or less directly from Aldo Leopold's field notes while he was visiting the shack. And the manuscripts that he wrote from the shack journals were actually among the last to sort of be added to the volume. Many of the other essays had been previously published in other publications. But what he really worked on toward the very end of getting this manuscript ready to deliver to a publisher was the upshot, the final section in which he introduces to the world this idea of a land ethic. And although that may seem strange to us, in 1949, this was a very, very new concept. And it was decades before the rest of us really caught on to what Aldo Leopold was talking about and really adopted the idea of ethics being essential to our relationship with the natural world. But they all the essays start this way, on a yellow legal pad with Leopold's neat, tight handwriting, usually goes through several drafts before he's finally happy with the final product and is willing to incorporate it into his book manuscript. So if we start with childhood, the boyhood in Iowa from 1887 when he was born to 1904 when he heads east to go to school, there is only one essay from his childhood, which is kind of interesting because his childhood was obviously quite a formative period in sort of shaping where he was headed for the rest of his life. But it had to do with Aldo Leopold's lifelong passion for hunting, especially bird hunting. And his father took him duck hunting at the Crystal Lake Club, which was a duck hunting club. And the one essay, there's Aldo and his father. It looks like Aldo's got a gun under his arm there, heading off for the day. But the one essay that from his childhood is Red Legs Kicking. And for someone like Aldo Leopold, who was a lifelong hunter, it's not surprising that there would be an essay about the first duck that he shot during his life. And he describes this black duck finally coming in just at sunset. And he doesn't remember the shot. I remember only my unspeakable delight when my first duck hit the snowy ice with a thud and lay there belly up, red legs kicking. Well, for some people who read a Sand County Almanac, they may be jarred by the fact that the first essay really describing his life is one about hunting, but Leopold was a lifelong hunter and was not at all ashamed of that. But as I said, when he enters his professional career in the Forest Service, he leaves Yale literally with a diploma in one hand and his contract to work for the new Forest Service in the other. They shipped him out to the Arizona and New Mexico territories. They weren't even states then. And he was essentially responsible for managing, quite literally, millions of acres of newly designated national forest land on public lands in Arizona and New Mexico. Here's this kid from the Midwest with an Ivy League education, and he suddenly plopped down in an alien environment with challenges that we can't even imagine for somebody as young as him. Not only figuring out what was on the forest, but figuring out who was there. The Native Americans who had lived there for millennia, the Hispanics and ranchers who had moved into those lands, all of which needed to be managed. And Aldo Leopold obviously threw himself into the task. So there are 7 essays from his time in the Southwest and in Mexico. And they include what is arguably the favorite essay of most people who have read a Sand County Almanac, and that is the essay Thinking Like a Mountain, which is one of Leopold's sort of masterpieces in terms of not only revealing a lot about himself, but giving us a really important conservation message. So you'll all be familiar with the opening lines. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. This essay almost never happened. The original draft of this essay was an impersonal essay talking about predator control programs that the federal government had engaged in the Southwest. He gave the early draft to one of his favorite graduate students to review, Al Hochbaum, and Al wrote back, and he said, "This is just unacceptable. You have to come clean that you were an active part of this. You weren't a third-person observer. You killed a wolf. You need to come clean." It totally changed the character of the essay, turning it into a very personal account, but one that still had that strong conservation message. Well, despite the impact that this essay has had, there were many in the conservation community who doubted the veracity of the story. And the reason is Aldo Leopold kept journals. Virtually every day of this guy's life is recorded in one of his journals. And nowhere in his journals do you find an account of shooting a wolf. So many historians said, this is a great parable, but it never really happened the way he described it here. And it was in limbo whether this was a real story or not until Aldo Leopold's son, Luna, died. And in his safe deposit box was a packet of letters that Aldo had written home to his parents while he was getting his feet settled in Arizona and New Mexico. And the essay starts out, "Dear Mama," and it's described, this, by the way, is in the 2nd week that he's in Arizona. So he's literally getting his feet on the ground. And in this letter, it goes on about things that are not of great historical note. But then it's, by the way, Wheatley and I have killed 2 timber wolves and 2 turkeys and a lot of grouse, but no deer. And you're just waiting. Okay, next comes the green fire, the epiphany. Nope. The next paragraph, Aldo Leopold grumbles about the fact that in the scramble to get his gun, he lost his favorite pipe. For 22-year-old Aldo Leopold, that was the significance, although obviously reflecting on what he had done, the epiphany was quite real. So when we made the film Green Fire, documenting Aldo Leopold's life, based on the fact that where he was the day that he shot the wolf was in his Forest Service logbook, the film crew was able to go to the exact spot from which he took the famous shot. So when I said it was an epiphany, and Aldo Leopold did one of his notorious 180 degrees on something that he formerly felt strongly about, but subsequently figured out was wrong-headed. So if we look at 1916, the sportsmen demand the eradication of lions, wolves, coyotes, and bobcats. Either wolves or game must go. And then fast forward to Sand County Almanac, harmony with land is like harmony with a friend. You cannot cherish his right hand and chop off his left. You cannot love game and hate predators. The 180 degree is complete. Another really significant event, and I'll apologize if I don't hit your favorite essays. I can only do so much in an hour. But another very influential essay reflecting something that was important to Leopold was his time just across the border in northern Mexico. It was a hunting trip to the Rio Gavilan watershed. And Leopold was astounded at the change that he saw crossing the border. North of the border, in the lands that he was responsible for managing, he was able to see the signs that human beings had significantly impacted that landscape. He was astute enough as a naturalist and sort of nascent ecologist that he could see the signature of human beings all over the land that he was responsible for. But as he said, he crosses the border, and even though people had lived in the Rio Gavilan watershed literally for millennia with Native Americans and Hispanics that had moved in, he said, it was here that I first clearly realized that land is an organism, that all my life I had seen only sick land, whereas here was a biota still in perfect aboriginal health. The term unspoiled wilderness took on a new meaning. That new meaning was that you can retain wildness while people are living and making a living on the land if you manage it carefully. So this was a very important event for Leopold. And this essay, The Song of the Gavilan, is often used as a textbook example of poetic science, where an author very skillfully uses poetic language to convey a very complex scientific idea. In this case, it's Leopold talking about the complexity of ecosystems. And he describes the complexity of ecosystems as a song. To hear even a few notes of it, you must know the speech of the hills and rivers, a vast pulsing harmony, its score inscribed on 1,000 hills, its notes the lives and deaths of plants and animals, its rhythm spanning the seconds and the centuries. What Leopold is doing in a very poetic way is describing the complexity of ecosystems. And it was in the Rio Gavilan that he witnessed the complexities of an ecosystem still functioning, even though people were present on the land. From 1924 to 1948, Aldo Leopold is back in the Midwest. He gets transferred from the Southwest, and he'd reached sort of the highest levels of the Forest Service that he could reach there. So he was given a choice. You can go to Washington, D.C. for a desk job, or you can go to Madison, Wisconsin, and take up the associate directorship of the brand new Forest Products Laboratory. That wasn't exactly Aldo Leopold's specialty, but he had already impressed his peers in the Forest Service with his scientific approach. And as a result, they thought he would be an important contribution to the Forest Products Lab, which was sort of the research arm of the Forest Service. So from 1924 to 28, he sticks it out with the Forest Service, is miserable, and finally in 1928, he quits cold turkey. This is a pretty bold thing to do. He's got a wife and 5 kids at home. He's got a high-paying, secure government job that really isn't asking much of him except to pursue his own interests, but he'd had it with the Forest Service, especially that they weren't moving on his idea of what today we would call ecosystem management as the objective for national forests. So from 1948 until he dies in 1948, there are 6 essays that have to do with the Midwest. And these essays come from his, of course, childhood, knowing the Midwest, but most importantly, after he quits the Forest Service in 1928, he takes a contract job for a group called the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute. This is a trade group for manufacturers of hunting equipment. And they were very concerned that wildlife, especially game species in the upper Midwest, had essentially collapsed. And it was affecting their bottom line. There weren't as many people hunting. There just wasn't much game to be hunted. White-tailed deer were virtually gone. Wild turkeys were gone. Wildfowl, waterfowl were depleted. You go on and on. It was a pretty grim situation. So they hired this bright up-and-coming guy who was establishing a reputation as a sort of a progressive thinker to go out and figure out what's wrong. And the contract made it pretty clear that they expected that he was going to go out and conclude that it was a failure of protection. There weren't enough game wardens enforcing the laws. The laws were too lax. There was too much poaching. In other words, the frame of reference was if wildlife is in trouble, it must be because we're killing them. This was on the heels of the passenger pigeon going extinct, the bison nearly disappearing. So that was the mindset. That was the paradigm in wildlife conservation. Leopold does his 3-year tour going all over the Midwest. He publishes a book summarizing his findings and concludes, to everyone's surprise, that it wasn't a failure of protection. It was the habitat that had deteriorated. And as obvious as that seems to us today, in 1931, that was a paradigm-busting revelation, that the condition of wildlife in the Midwest had everything to do with what we were doing to the land, especially in terms of agriculture. So there's one essay, which will resonate, I'm sure, with many of you who've driven across Illinois. The Illinois bus ride, describing a trip across Illinois. The highway stretches like a tightrope across the corn, oats, and clover fields. The bus ticks off the opulent miles. The passengers talk and talk and talk. To them, Illinois is only the sea on which they sail to ports unknown. But this was a very important experience for Leopold. It gave him insights that he had not previously had about the importance of managing habitat as a way of improving the status of wildlife populations. And he does something with those findings. In 1933, he publishes a book called Game Management. This book is the real paradigm-busting book. It turns the page from wildlife protection and says that's not enough. You need to actively manage wildlife, especially wildlife habitat, not just protect them from direct harm from people. It essentially introduced to the world this new field of wildlife management. Prior to the publication of this book, if you were professionally engaged in wildlife conservation, it's almost certain you were a game warden. You were there to enforce laws protecting wildlife. After the publication of this book, the profession quickly turned to wildlife manager, somebody who was very skilled in manipulating ecological systems to benefit wildlife. And his growing fame lands him an unprecedented opportunity to have a faculty position at the University of Wisconsin. To say that this was an unlikely event is an understatement. It's 1933, Great Depression. University's budget had to be in the tank. Here's this guy, Aldo Leopold, has no PhD, never taught a course in his life, and represents a new field, wildlife management, that had never before been present in the halls of academia. Why would a dean of the College of Agriculture invest a precious faculty position in such a gamble? Well, it turns out we know the backstory. Some of Aldo Leopold's bird watching and hunting buddies in Madison, who were well-to-do, donated his salary for the first 5 years, which made it a little easier for the dean to hire him. Obviously, that investment paid huge dividends, and Leopold would spend the rest of his career as a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin. Marshland Elegy, written in 1937, is another one of people's favorites, readers' favorites. It's again a beautifully written essay. Aldo Leopold had become enamored of cranes when he was in Arizona and New Mexico, because tens and hundreds of thousands of lesser sandhill cranes coming out of the North American Arctic spend the winter there, especially in the areas where he went duck hunting. So he grew very fond of sandhill cranes. When he moved back to the Midwest, he was shocked that there were no cranes on the landscape. And he wanted to know what happened. Where did the cranes go? He contacted everyone he could think of in the upper Midwest and concluded basically that there were just a few dozen cranes in each of Wisconsin and Michigan, holding on in the last few remnants of wild places. The rest of them had literally been shot out. We killed them. It wasn't habitat loss. It wasn't pollution. We literally killed them. So in 1937, we're now a decade after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protected sandhill cranes and other migratory birds. Leopold was a big advocate for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but he didn't hold out much hope for the sandhill crane. The essay, the first half of the essay is wonderful. It's extolling the majesty of sandhill cranes. He describes them as the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. What a beautiful turn of phrase. And then the second half of the essay, he lowers the boom. That, oh, by the way, they're not going to be around much longer. So it sort of ends the essay on a pessimistic note. We all know what happened. Eventually, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the protection that it afforded started to take its effect. Sandhill cranes were only able to increase their numbers very slowly. And by 1937, any increase in numbers would have been absolutely impossible to detect. But now, of course, here in the Midwest population, we've got almost 100,000 of them, and they literally have saturated the Midwest and are now recolonizing surrounding areas. Another Midwestern essay, this one for a species that wasn't quite as successful. The passenger pigeon, of course, didn't live long enough to receive the benefits of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And Wisconsin did something that was unprecedented. We erected a monument to the passenger pigeon at Wyalusing State Park. How many of you visited? Okay, most of you. For the rest of you, please do. It's a beautiful site on a bluff overlooking the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers. But the monument that was raised is a special one in the history of mankind. And it's special because it was the very first time that human beings had ever so publicly acknowledged the fact that we were responsible for causing another species to go extinct. Now, on the occasion of the dedication of the plaque, Leopold was asked to give a talk, which eventually turned into the essay on a monument to the pigeon. And he really, of course, as he is so wonderfully capable of doing, in a brief sentence, he can capture the essence of what this monument is all about. For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun. It is essentially the arrival of our moral consciousness of the fact that we are the agent of extinction for many, many species. So for Aldo Leopold, who never actually got to see a passenger pigeon, he left us probably one of the most memorable essays about the bird that he never got to see. So for many people, the first half of a Sand County Almanac is basically focused on the shack years. These are essays that are taken directly from Aldo Leopold's journals, from the visits that he and his family and students and friends paid to this humble abode on the banks of the Wisconsin River. Leopold bought this dilapidated farm in 1935. It was literally a basket case. The farmstead had burned down. The only building left on the property was an outhouse that had previously housed chickens. When Leopold described his purchase to the family, he said, "You're going to love it. It's this cute little cabin on the banks of the Wisconsin River." Well, he marched them up there in the middle of winter. They had to trudge in a couple of miles through the snow to get there. And his daughter, of course, described the scene. She said, "It was a chicken coop knee deep in manure. The surrounding landscape was nothing but corn stubble and cockleburs. What was my father thinking?" Well, of course, by this time, by 1935, Leopold was inventing yet another field, ecological restoration. He started with experiments at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, but he was very anxious to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And he wanted to do it on his own land. So he picked this basket case of a property in order to demonstrate that we could take sick land and by careful management, bring it back to health. So from those 13 years, from 35 to 48, Leopold and his family not only enjoyed their time at the shack, but worked really hard bringing the land back to health. But as you know, if you remember the first half of the book, the Almanac, it is basically a phenological account of what happened throughout the year at the shack. Phenology was something that Leopold had been passionate about since childhood. He started keeping phenological records while he was in grade school. He'd been influenced by what was then the prominent form of what today we would call environmental education, called the nature study movement. Virtually every school in the country followed this curriculum, which encouraged students to get outside on their own, make observations of nature, take notes, take photographs, do drawings, whatever, but bring it back into the classroom and figure out what it was all about. For Leopold, he got hooked on phenology. Phenology, of course, being the study of the timing of seasonal events. And for Leopold, the Almanac is essentially a distillation of some of his favorite seasonal events that were observed at the shack. And in writing about phenology, he says, "Keeping records enhances the pleasures of the search and the chance of finding order and meaning in these events." For Aldo Leopold, keeping journals describing what he was seeing in nature, it was all about the pleasure of the search. He's just recording the wonderful times, the wonderful experiences that he had. But he was clever enough to realize that, hey, I could retrospectively go back to my journals and make sense out of it. I could find order and meaning in what I had seen, which was the hallmark of a true naturalist. Naturalists collect things, whether it's dinosaur skeletons in a museum or plants in a herbarium, but then they retrospectively try to make sense of what they collected. Leopold collected observations of phenology. So the 22 Almanac essays, again, include some real favorites. They're short. For anyone here in the Midwest, they resonate because they're things that we're familiar with. So among them, there is one essay that reveals that Leopold was translating his journals into science. And it he sneaked it in, snuck it in to the essay Prairie Birthday. Prairie Birthday, he's describing a country graveyard on his way from Madison to the shack. Still there, by the way. It's triangular in shape, and where they couldn't get the mower into the sharp corners of the cemetery, there was still a remnant of prairie vegetation, including a compass plant. And he describes the setting, the history, but then here it is, the revelation that Leopold is actually using these observations for scientific discovery. This year, I found the silphium in first bloom on 24 July. A week later than usual. During the last 6 years, the average date was 15 July. Well, the only way he could have done that, of course, is if he'd gone back to his notes and calculated what the average had been. So why was he doing that? Well, it was Leopold trying to make a big sense out of all of his observations of over 300 species of plants and animals. This guy was a good naturalist. He kept track of a lot of things. So he went back and tried to make sense out of what amounted to almost 1,000 pages of field notes. And we know from the Leopold archives at the University of Wisconsin that what he did with this was to put them in a 1945 version of Excel spreadsheet. It was hundreds of pages of graph paper in which he tediously hand transcribed from his journals for all of these 300 species what his observations were. And his reason for doing that was that he wanted to write a paper, a scientific paper about phenology and what he thought was its importance for ecologists. Ecologists by the 1940s, it was a pretty young science, and they had pretty much shunned anything that smacked of natural history. Natural history wasn't serious science. That was just a hobby. Leopold wanted to convince them otherwise. So he takes all of this analysis, and in 1947, he publishes another influential book, A Phenological Record for Sauk and Dane Counties, Wisconsin, 1935 to 1945. He publishes an ecological monographs, the premier journal of the Ecological Society of America. And given the bias that they had against things like phenology that smacked of old-fashioned natural history, how in the world did he get this published? He was the president-elect of the Ecological Society of America, and I suspect the editor was not going to reject a paper by the incoming president. Well, the editor probably should have voted to reject the paper. It was hardly cited at all. Nobody paid any attention to it because it was out of the mainstream of where ecology was heading. It wasn't until decades later, almost 50 years later, that people started to realize that, oh, wow, those phenological records that people like Aldo Leopold kept are an important historical marker against which we can compare how plants and animals are responding to climate change today. So Leopold's paper is now, what we're now 75 years after he published it, is cited far more than it was during the first 50 years of its existence, because it is such a remarkable piece. At the Aldo Leopold Foundation, of course, we've continued Aldo Leopold's record keeping, and we publish every year a phenology calendar. How many of you get the phenology calendar? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay. We sell thousands of these. It's become very popular. And month by month, we give you a way of anticipating what's happening in the near future. And as I said, it all traces back to Aldo Leopold's boyhood passion for phenology. So keeping track of seasonal events was something that Aldo Leopold had been passionate about since childhood. But once he bought the shack, his interest in another sort of rhythm of nature became again an obsession with him. He became obsessed with the dawn chorus of birds. It turns out these two essays, Great Possessions, which, by the way, Great Possessions was the original title that Aldo Leopold had chosen for the book. Oxford University Press rejected that after Leopold had died and said it was too close to another book that was in print, and they came up with the Sand County Almanac. But Great Possessions and the Coral Copse, basically Leopold describes his obsession with the dawn chorus. It turns out Aldo Leopold is an insomniac. He stayed up all night doing spreadsheets, making handcrafted longbows, doing all kinds of things when he couldn't sleep. But when he finally did get to sleep, he didn't sleep long. He was an early riser. And in the essay, Great Possessions, he talks about this. My daily ceremony, contrary to what you might suppose, begins with the utmost decorum. At 3:30 a.m., with such dignity as I can muster, I step from my cabin door, bearing in either hand a pot of coffee and notebook. I get out my watch, pour coffee, and lay notebook on knee. This is the cue for the proclamations to begin. The proclamations, of course, are birds waking up and joining the dawn chorus. And Leopold just became obsessed with recording when birds joined the dawn chorus, how frequently they sang, and pretty quickly figured out that there's a pattern there. There's order in what I'm observing. And he, for the first time in his life, used the scientific method. He described a hypothesis, and he set out to test the hypothesis. His hypothesis was that birds joined the dawn chorus in response to the growing intensity of light, and that they're not cued to join the chorus until the light intensity reaches a certain level. So how did he do an experiment to test this? Well, it was a simple experiment. He recorded the observations on clear mornings and overcast mornings. And on overcast mornings, of course, it doesn't get bright until later. And he observed that, yep, sure enough, the birds joined the dawn chorus later on cloudy mornings. So here's again, the Excel spreadsheet in which he's laying out his observations of clear days and cloudy days and trying to make sense out of it. Leopold was preparing a manuscript when he died that would have described his findings on the dawn chorus. He never finished that, but of course we have the two essays. So a few years ago, the National Science Foundation was launching a new funding program for a new field called soundscape ecology. Soundscape ecologists are people who study the totality of sound that's associated with an ecosystem. And they analyze it to death, trying to figure out what the signal of that noise, that sound means for the functioning of an ecosystem. Well, one of my good friends was one of the founders of this field, and he wanted to hold the National Science Foundation sort of launch of this program at the Aldo Leopold Center because he was a big fan of Sand County Almanac and knew of Leopold's passion for sound. It's inescapable. When you read his essays, there are literally dozens and dozens, if not over 100 mentions of the sound of nature. So he said, Stan, would you be willing to do the opening keynote for the session at the Leopold Center and talk about Leopold and sound? So having looked at the unpublished manuscript and knowing what Leopold was about, I decided to do something that I thought the soundscape ecologists would be interested in. And that is try to recreate from Leopold's notes the dawn chorus that he was listening to back in the 1940s. I enlisted the help of one of our graduate students who had seen the light and gave up a career as an audio engineer for rock bands and came back to get a degree in ecology. And I said, Chris, you know, we can get the recordings of the bird songs from the Cornell Lab for Ornithology, my old alma mater. He said, can you mix them if we follow Leopold's score, essentially? He said, wow, no problem at all. So he assembled it and he said, but this is not going to work. He said, we need a background to tie it all together. So Chris was into recording sound, so we couldn't do it at the shack. You all know why. Interstate 90 is a half mile away. There's the thrum of the highway 24/7. So I set Chris up in my restored prairie in Mazomanie, still in the Wisconsin River Valley. Got him out there before dawn. He's recording the background sound. I'm on my deck having a cup of coffee. Every once in a while, there's a loud curse coming out of the prairie. A plane flew over. A car drove by. One of the neighbor's chickens crowed. All things that ruined his background sound. But eventually he got it together. We recreated what Leopold was listening to as he describes in the Coral Copse. In June, it's completely predictable that the robin will give voice when the light intensity reaches 100th candle power, and the bedlam of other singers will follow in predictable sequence. So we picked the 1st of June, 1940, from 4 to 4:30 in the morning. And we sort of condensed that half hour into 5 minutes by shortening the interval between when birds sang, but the rest of it is pretty much accurate. During that half hour, he recorded 17 species of birds. He recorded all the details of when they were joining, how often they sang, but he also knew where they were singing from because he mapped out their territory. So Chris said, well, I can put this into a stereo environment. So if you listen to it, the birds on the right are coming from the woods, the birds on the left are coming from the prairie, and the birds in the middle are edge species. So we put it all together. We got the thing all put together in time for the soundscape ecologists, and we wowed them with a historical recreation from an era before tape recording. Oh no, are you hearing it out there? Oh, okay. So there's the robin giving first voice. In the interest of time, I'll skip to the middle period. Can you hear that? No? Okay, good. Doesn't sound like much, but I get feedback. There are a few species like the crows that tune in on the background sound. Or you can go toward the end when the full simply is in full voice. So you've got pretty much all 17. Well, the soundscape ecologist was blown away. This is incredible. We know of no one who was able to take such detailed notes about a soundscape as Leopold did in an era before there was tape recording, when he could only rely on his ear, his ability to translate the sound into notes. So as I said, Leopold was a lifelong hunter. And another one of the essays that involves hunting is smoky gold. There are two kinds of hunting, ordinary hunting and rough grouse hunting. There are two places to hunt grouse, ordinary places in Adams County. There are two times to hunt in Adams County, ordinary times, and when the tamaracks are smoky gold. Leopold loved upland game bird hunting, and rough grouse hunting was really his favorite. However, his upland game bird hunting almost ruined his marriage. Back up to his time in Arizona and New Mexico, he was given a bonus. And Leopold, using this bonus, wanted to have a custom-made shotgun. His wife, Estella, wanted one of these newfangled washing machines for the 4 kids at home. Well, Leopold may have been in the doghouse for a while, but we do know that Estella got her washing machine. But Leopold bought his custom-made A.H. Fox 20-gauge double-barreled shotgun. It was one of the premier pieces of gunsmithing in the country. And this was the gun that he used to hunt for the rest of his life. The gun was lost. Nobody ever knew what happened to it. And just a few years ago, one of Aldo Leopold's great-great-great-grandchildren said, I inherited this shotgun. I have absolutely no interest in it, but someone said it may have belonged to Aldo Leopold. Are you interested in it? So of course, the Leopold Foundation we got the gun, and sure enough, it's Aldo's gun. We knew it was valuable because A.H. Fox shotguns are collector's items. So we had it appraised. The appraiser said, well, this is the easiest job I'm ever going to have. Because he said, within the year, I appraised a similar gun that was sold at auction. It was the same model. It was owned by a famous conservationist, Teddy Roosevelt, and it sold for 6 figures. So Aldo Leopold's shotgun had increased almost 1,000-fold since he bought it. But grouse hunting in central Wisconsin, here's a photograph of a successful day, several grouse, Leopold's favorite gun, picnic basket. He's obviously taken off his boots. And there's a bottle he's holding in his hand. It's one of the rare photos that we have of Leopold with a broad smile. And whether it was the grouse or the bottle, we'll leave up to your imagination. So in addition to hunting, Leopold also was an avid bird bander. And the SA 65290 is obviously a favorite for anyone who bands birds. 65290, which was the band number of a chickadee, has long since gone to his reward. I hope that in his new woods, great oaks full of ants' eggs keep falling all day long, with never a wind to ruffle his composure or take the edge off his appetite. And I hope he still wears my band. Anyone who bands birds knows that you're basically putting a bet on this bird that you'll ever be able to find out what happens to it. 65290 was a favorite of Leopold's because it lived longer than any of the other dozens of chickadees that he banded at the shack. And if you go to the shack journals, you can find the history of 65290. So the story in the essay accurately reflects what was known about 65290. But when you go to the first draft of the essay, whoops, 65290 was not the original subject. It was only just a year before he finished the manuscript that 65290 overtook 65287 as the longest lived chickadee. So the number ended up having to be changed. Which finally brings us to what I said was the most important part of a Sand County Almanac, probably, the upshot, in which he introduces this twin concept of land health and a land ethic. These ideas really were the end result of his life journey, in the course of which he's felt sorrow, anger, puzzlement, and confusion over the inability of conservation to halt the juggernaut of land abuse. This is Leopold essentially giving us his best guess as to what will be required for people to live sustainably on the planet. And he sets up healthy land as being the goal. Conservation is a state of health in the land. The land consists of soil, water, plants, and animals, but land health is more than a sufficiency of these components. It is a state of vigorous self-renewal in each of them and in all collectively. Today, we might interject the term resilience, the ability of the important components of an ecosystem to bounce back after they have been in some way injured. So for Leopold, healthy land has resilience. And obviously, that is what sustainable living on the land tries to achieve. So how do you get there? Leopold spent his life journey trying to figure this out. And he summarizes it again in a couple of sentences. We tried to get conservation by buying land, by subsidizing desirable changes in land use, and by passing restrictive laws. The last method largely failed. The other two have produced only small samples of success. Gee, everything I've tried throughout my career isn't working. We need something better, something that's more enduring, something that's wider in its scope, more holistic. And Leopold comes up with his best guess. We seem ultimately always throwing back on individual ethics as the basis of land conservation. It's hard to make a man, by pressure of law or money, do a thing which does not spring naturally from his own personal sense of right and wrong. There it is, the ethics of conservation, the ethics of living sustainably on the planet. And as he said in the essay, The Land Ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. He's using community as a concept that everyone understands. We live in human communities, and there has to be a set of moral guidelines about how you live in that community if the community is going to function. And by analogy, Leopold is saying we also live in ecological communities, and there have to be similar rules on how we live in that ecological community if it's going to function. And the land ethic then reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, a moral compass, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Leopold never gets to explore his idea further, of course, because he dies shortly after he's written the essay, The Land Ethic. But he does leave us something remarkable, a maxim. Maxims are these concise little statements, which Leopold was so good at composing that just perfectly capture what he's getting at. You probably have this on a t-shirt or a coffee mug somewhere. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. A simple statement of what the land ethic is all about in terms of right and wrong behavior. So that's the end of the essays. Leopold starts trying to publish the books in 1944. He starts writing the book in 1942. Most of his male students, of course, are off at war. He's got plenty of time on his hands to devote to writing the book. 1944, he starts shopping this manuscript around to various publishers who all quickly reject the manuscript, sometimes brutally so. But then finally, in April of 1948, Oxford University Press says, yep, we'll agree to publish Great Possessions. Tragically, 1 week later, Aldo Leopold died of a heart attack while helping the neighbor fight a grass fire at the shack. And it wasn't until the 20th of October, 1949, that a Sand County Almanac was eventually published. And when I say the reviews on the rejection letters, some of them were pretty harsh. This from Macmillan. We do not feel that a volume of essays on outdoor topics would find a wide enough market to warrant our use of paper at this time. Ouch. It is the war years and there is rationing, but still, that's a pretty harsh way of putting down an author. Not worth the paper it would be printed on. Alfred Knopp. Emphasis on the ecological ideas you've incorporated into your manuscript concern them. It seems to us that these ecological theories, this is the upshot that they're talking about, are very difficult to present successfully to the layman. They go on to say, if you just leave out the upshot and expand the almanac essays, those cute little short essays about natural history, we might reconsider. Well, obviously, the upshot becomes the most important part of the book. Finally, Oxford University Press says it was agreed that we are to publish your book, Great Possessions, as illustrated by Charles Schwartz. Leopold at least got to know that his book was going to find it into print before he tragically died at age 61. Everyone else in his immediate family lived into their 90s. And just imagine if he had lived for another 30 years, he would have lived into the modern environmental era when a Sand County Almanac suddenly became a famous piece of work. So the post-publication timeline sort of reflects the evolution of our thinking about conservation. The other publishers were right. For 20 years, it hardly sold at all. I think it sold basically to family, friends, and students. 1961, when I first encountered it, it was temporarily out of print. They'd finally gone through the first 1,000 copies. How many copies of your book are you hoping to sell? But then in 1966, Oxford University Press does something that was either brilliant marketing or just plain dumb luck. They came out with a paperback edition just when the modern environmental movement was really gathering steam. And suddenly, 20 some years after Leopold had written this material, there was suddenly an audience ready to read his book, understand what it was about, and basically adopt his book as what many call the Bible of the modern environmental movement. And it's now translated into 15 languages, millions of copies sold, and of course is one of the most famous books in environmental literature. So where do we stand today, 75 years after Leopold introduced his idea about a land ethic? We're still striving. We're still trying to get it right. And Leopold acknowledged that this idea was not going to happen quickly. He pointed out in his essay that, look, this is similar to getting human rights done correctly. And here we are, thousands of years, and we still haven't gotten human rights settled properly. He said, it may take as long to establish an ethical relationship with nature. But then he gives us the charge. He leaves it up to us. Says, I have purposely presented a land ethic as the product of social evolution because nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It evolves in the minds of a thinking community. Aldo Leopold said, hey, it's up to you to invent a land ethic. I've given you the blueprint, but it's up to us, the thinking community, to flesh this out and to make it happen. So 2024 is a big year, obviously, at the Aldo Leopold Foundation. We're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Sand County Almanac. A special new edition of a Sand County Almanac was printed with a beautiful foreword by Barbara Kingsolver, the author. But we're also a lesser known, perhaps, milestone. It's 100 years since Aldo Leopold more or less single-handedly engineered the designation of the first wilderness area on public lands in the US, when he managed to convince the Forest Service to dedicate the Gila watershed as the nation's first designated wilderness area. That was 100 years ago. That was in, 1924. Do you remember when we finally got around to passing the Wilderness Act, which made it official? 1964, 40 years after Leopold had shown us the way with the Gila Wilderness. So I hope that gave you, I hope I hit some of your favorite essays, but I hope it gave you a little more appreciation of the story behind this famous book. So be happy to answer any questions.